I'd like to extend my thanks to the organisers for the invitation to attend and participate here. So thank you very, very much. Second comment is for those of you that were slow getting your tea, the fact that I was at the back of the line gave you that extra time. So hopefully you're all well fed, bickied out, and I will have my biscuit later on. The subject of what we're going to address over the next 30 to 40 minutes, I'm going to try and gallop through it at that pace so it leaves some time for questions later, is this one. You can read the question, but always fun to hear it spoken in the out loud voice. How does animal welfare legislation, enforcement, and the concept of sentience translate into the daily lives and practical protection of New Zealand's animals? So, in essence, it's trying to put a lot of what we've already discussed over the last few days together. That breaks down into two key issues, or two separate issues with some subheadings there. Break down the topic. From what we've heard over the last day and a half, how are you defining sentience? And if somebody was to say to you, or write it down on that piece of paper in front of you, what would that look like? You know, it's always tempting as a law lecturer to get people to do that, no matter what forum you're in. It's begging it. So just to keep you a little bit on tender hooks for the next 30, 40 minutes, I may stop the conversation at some point saying, so what did you write down on your piece of paper? So how are you defining sentience? How are you defining welfare? It would be fun to unpack this, wouldn't it? But what's your definition of animal welfare? It's been bandied around in our conversation for the last 24 hours. So again, what's your definition? Just for your entertainment's sake, if as you're reading, as we're going through this, you might want to jot down what your definition is, would be my very respectful suggestion. And then compare your answer. We might not pick on you, but compare your answer with where we are by the end of this presentation. And what's your definition of enforcement? Additionally, what's the purpose of enforcement? Based on what you've heard over the last 24 hours, including that very, I always enjoy Antoine. It's been a long time since we caught up in person, but a very insightful presentation. Second part, translating all that into the daily lives to practical protection of New Zealand's animals, boils down to this question, doesn't it? Is the law protecting sentient Kiwi animals? I've taken a bit of liberty there to add the Kiwi, and obviously not restricted to the Kiwi, but is it protecting our animals? How do we stack up internationally? And you heard some of Antoine's perspectives on that. One of the things, or lines from Antoine in that last presentation that I particularly liked, and I may be a little bit biased because of the legal background, is he said, and I quote, "If it's not legal, it's not..." Thank you. Excellent. Whoever that was gets the last bicky. So keeping that in mind, let's have a look at a few things. I'm going to obviously speak to the slide. Again, the question is, how are you defining sentience? You heard Joyce's presentation yesterday, and not only the importance around the Treaty of Lisbon, but what was its purpose? How are you defining animal welfare law? And my question to you is, what are the key words that link all three of those, 1, 2, and 3? We covered them yesterday as well. But what comes to mind? Well-being. Sorry? Well-being. Well-being, yes. In terms of the law, how's that described? Pain and distress. Remember those words? All of those. Or, alternatively, what are pain and distress described as? Suffering. And again, I go back to Joyce's presentation yesterday about the prevention of suffering. Those terms are common to all those objectives, right? And it's important that those terms occur in the law. Here's the question then. If sentience is acknowledging that animals feel. And in terms of what do they feel pain, distress, otherwise known as suffering. Or we have an objective that animals should be treated humanely, and that they should, not experience suffering. Then where on this line did the law acknowledge sentience? We've moved from pre-1830s, and you heard Bob mention 1822. I just put 1830 there for sort of round figures. We've moved, if you look at various countries, from a legislative establishment where there's no protection through to anti-cruelty law, right, which says you shall not do this to animals, whether it's beating or kicking or whatever. We've moved that, and then the concept of the 5 freedoms was born. It was translated into what we know as animal welfare law, and the distinctive difference between anti-cruelty and welfare is the positive duties of care. Remember? That not only should you not do things to animals, i.e. anti-cruelty, but you must also do certain things, as in provide for their needs. And I think it was Colin yesterday that mentioned the initiative that we implemented laws on the basis of prevention rather than cure, working at the top of the cliff rather than at the bottom of the cliff, of the law being enacted after the animal actually suffered. What can we do to prevent that? Putting animals very at the almost centre of animal welfare legislation. So where did the law recognise sentience? Oh, you so want to write that down on your piece of paper, don't you? Are you sitting there at this point wondering if I'm going to ask somebody? Come on, Peter. What did you write down? Where does it occur? A, B, C, D, or E? C. All in favour of C, say aye. Okay. Any advances on C, just for the fun of it? Who says B? See, who says B? Hands up. 1, 2, 3, 4. We're going to need at least 4 extra biscuits. All right? Because I'm in agreement with B. When the law recognised that animals could experience pain, distress, and suffering, it recognised them as animate objects and consequently sentient. Going back to what Bob was talking about, very first thing yesterday morning with Jeremy Bentham. Remember Jeremy Bentham's famous quote? Yes? It feels like a class, doesn't it? It's always the teacher that has so much more fun. But remember Jeremy Bentham's comment? Now, Simon Broonman and Debbie Legg wrote a book, Animals and the Law. And they made the suggestion, and personally I'm in agreement, that the only thing that's changed since that point in time is our understanding of animals, and consequently what constitutes pain, distress, i.e. suffering to animals. Science has informed us, we've learned more. IT, we've heard that mentioned over the last 24 hours. Communication, what people expect, and what becomes publicly and politically palatable. Same sentiment as what Antoine was referring to a couple of moments ago. And that, what's publicly and politically palatable, has informed this shift from 1830 to 1911, which was the Animal Protection Act, and in New Zealand, 1999, where we got the Animal Enforcement Act. Along all stages there's this issue of enforcement. Of course, back Richard Martin was one of the first that recognised that you can have all the law you want, but if it's not adequately resourced to enable enforcement, well, it's paper. Right? And you may recall Richard Martin actually brought the first prosecution himself and actually paid for it. But what he wanted to make the point was, enforcement isn't, integral part of what we were talking about yesterday during that legal debate. Issue. The other principle that we have already unpacked over the last 24 hours is that animals are one of many stakeholders whose interests require representation. And the question, of course, is, well, are animals being adequately, do they have a strong enough voice? Again, I go back to previous presentations and what Antoine was saying earlier on about the voice of animals. And you may recall in the very last part of Antoine's presentation, he talked about strengthening that voice, in his opinion. All right? And the law, again, as what came from the legal debate yesterday, has the responsibility to take the interests and views and opinions of all those stakeholders and not only balance them. I was intrigued that he had a set of scales. I thought that was great. Not only balance them, but also prioritise them in a way that is publicly and politically accepted, palatable. And that's what shifts things along. So with that brief sort of background, let's move on to about New Zealand, looking at, the Kiwi animals. It's important, I think, to remember that law functions because of, because there are multiple stakeholders and it's got that balancing and prioritising exercise, that law tends to function frequently on minimums. That's the reality. Sort of whether you think a Ferrari or a BMW is the bee's knees of a car, nobody can force you, last I checked, to have one of those cars. You don't have to have the best of cars, but you do have to have a car that meets certain minimum standards. We call it a warrant of fitness. Same sort of thing. Law says, in the public interest, for public safety and the well-being of all stakeholders, let's make sure that the machine you're driving at least meets certain minimum standards. Again, we've got this progression, but let's look at some of the things that we actually do very, very well. We have a broad definition of an animal. Again, I refer back to Joyce's very insightful presentation yesterday. We have this broad definition. We also have a very broad net of liability from where that animal is, almost before it's born, if you like, if you look at the definition of an animal under the Animal Welfare Act, right through to the end of its life, whether that's a natural life, whether it's, it lives and dies in its sleep, whether it's at the end of a veterinarian's needle going into its arm as it's being put to sleep, or whether it's slaughtered. A lot of animals are captured in that definition in New Zealand, and we attach liability, and I'm going to unpack that shortly, to all people that are in that chain, whether it's the owner or a person in charge with care, supervision or control, whether it's management, directors, veterinarians, anybody, transporters, anybody that's had a dealing in that animal's minimum standard experience, we can hold them liable. That's already set out in law. There was already been reference in this conference to the fact that we've doubled penalties. We have a penalty structure where the penalty fits the crime. I won't unpack that because that would take more time than I've got at the moment. But yeah, we went so far as to introduce a new offence called reckless ill treatment. And for those involved with enforcement, that's made a significant difference in what we're seeing in the courts, in the charges that are being laid, and the penalties that are coming out the other end. And that's demonstrated in the courtroom. In terms of the New Zealand situation, I'd refer you again to a couple of comments made by the Minister yesterday. He started off by saying the Act is not broken. In terms of, Antoine's got some of his views and perspectives and very insightful on certain things, but as a starting point, we have a very good Act. And you may recall, I know listening around the dinner tables last night, there are a few of you that took comfort from the Minister's comment. The Animal Welfare Act is clearly based on a principle that animals are sentient. And very quickly, yes, the bickies go to the people who chose B. All right? And then Colin Holden yesterday spoke about the way forward. In terms of where we are, on a global basis with over 200 sovereign states on the planet, We're certainly not in a place where we've got no established law. We moved beyond that, goodness, nearly 200 years ago. We no longer sit in a place of animal anti-cruelty where we just prohibit blatant acts of cruelty to animals. We changed that in 1999, where New Zealand got the Animal Welfare Act. And in terms of these sorts of things, the breadth of the definition of an animal, the breadth of liability, the penalties, and the realities that are coming through the courts, we're doing very well. I've worked as a prosecutor with the ministry for about, between 5 and 6 years now. Time flies when having fun. And these things, even in my short time, I've seen significant changes in that, and I'm sure there'll be people around the room, in fact I know there are people around the room who would be of the same view. So in terms of New Zealand, we're doing very, very well. And I refer back to Joyce's comment yesterday about anthropomorphism, because we all, oh my goodness, I forgot I had a mic on. Okay, my apologies to those who had the earphones on. Hand on heart, that was supposed to be. A lot of us feel in respect of issues concerning animals, don't we? Right? I would pick that in this forum, that's a high driver, motivator. So in terms of anthropomorphism, how do you feel about our treatment of animals? And Joyce asked the question, where would you prefer to be? And bottom line, while there are certainly differences of being free range, I like the pictures of the chickens. I'm not so sure I would be delighted to be a Kiwi cow transported to China, I think was that video. We didn't see inside. I haven't seen the whole video yet, didn't get time for that last night. It might be cow nirvana in there. But the inference is clearly, let's see, cow in New Zealand versus cow in China in that facility. Not sure. Where would you rather be? But in terms of New Zealand, as I said, on a global basis, while we always progress, there's always going to be changes. But nonetheless, at this point in time, my suggestion is we're doing very, very well. The purpose of this purple triangle here, as it says, it goes on the principle that it's like in law, the view of the dissenting judges today often becomes the view of the majority tomorrow. So the people that were in English Parliament when Richard Martin and Lord Eskren, for example, were advocating that animals should be given protections, the people in Parliament who ridiculed them, laughed at them, mocked them, thought that they must have been on some form of 1830s drugs. Of course, their views, well, they were relevant there, but Lord Eskren, Richard Martin, and all those early pioneers of animal protection, their views became the norm half a century later. Right? We always need to be questioning. We're always polishing, perfecting, adapting as political and public opinion changes, as is set out in the Animal Welfare Act. We change depending on what, not just the media and political opinion, but on good practice and scientific evidence. The more we know, the more we adapt. Which brings us to, that was to be about New Zealand. Let's talk about some of the jugular issues that it seemed to me from listening to the tables last night and listening to the coffee and tea line that people are talking about. These are some of the questions I've summarised that I've heard in this forum. The question is, does it go far enough? Whoopsie. I'd respectfully suggest that does it go far enough might be slightly shifted as a question of can it, as the Animal Welfare Act, go far enough? Where do you draw the line? This was the question posed by Joyce in her presentation yesterday. we've all got various opinions as to where it's appropriate or not to draw the line, and will it make enough of a difference? What do you make a difference to? Even if you instigate some of the changes advocated, what difference would it make? And it's not a question of a challenge, it's a question of seeking to understand how would that work? In terms of point number 4, I'd respectfully suggest that, yes, we do talk about animals, that animals are, we need to strengthen their voice, as is the view of Antoine. But I'd go back to that third element of animal law itself that I referred to yesterday, that there's an inseparable connection between animals and people. So we talk about animal and people, and I'll explain this one shortly. This is why I became a veterinarian or a lawyer, because I'm not a very good house builder. But this is my graphic presentation of a house. And it's these basic headings were referred to by Bob yesterday, all right, in terms of objectives, what do we want to unpack and seek to understand in terms of this particular forum. The starting point from a legal perspective is that law has been described as a house of words. All the lawyers? Yes, I can see a couple of nods. Thank you, Will. Law's a house of words, and in terms of the law, words have power. Right? You change the word, and you change the potential responsibility, the obligation, and thereby the behaviour and the outcome. So looking at some of these boxes, these bricks in our house that Bob very kindly referred to in terms of a direction for the forum. This issue of sentience, it's almost, hopefully, I would submit that it's, in terms of the question of is sentience recognised in the Animal Welfare Act, the short answer is yes. It occurred as far as New Zealand and our animals in 1822. Okay, that's where it all began. They feel suffering. Look at this chain of bullet points here. How am I going, Bob? All right. Suffering. Suffering, we've said that in terms of sentience, it's that they can suffer, and we want to prevent their pain and distress. That occurs in the Animal Welfare Act. That's almost a discussion that's passé. Our law recognises that animals can feel pain and distress. We also want to, in terms of good law provides clarity, not confusion. As an example there, I'd suggest looking at the animal. How frequently do you talk with people, for example, in respect of the law, and you say animals, 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 animals? We do it in this conference. But a couple of bullet point references have been made in this conference, recognising that actually the legal animal doesn't include everything that's an animal. There are a ton of invertebrates and other species that are not captured under the Animal Welfare Act. They may be referred to under other acts, but the definition of an animal varies according to the piece of legislation that we're talking about. So we want to be clear. In some pieces of legislation, they refer to a horse, for example, and that refers to foals, mares, geldings, stallions, the whole lot. Other pieces of legislation, it's very, very specific. It covers a particular species up until the age of 6 months. And at 6 months and 21 days, it's no longer falling under the definition of an animal as per that piece of legislation. We want to have clarity rather than confusion. And there's been suggestion, I'm just putting up here what I've talked about with a couple of folk over the last few hours, in that can you overcomplicate it? It's a suggestion. Some law's not in the habit of duplicating its words. So if sentience means the same thing as suffering, pain, or distress, then why would, is it already covered? I'm being a little bit mischievous here. Part and parcel of giving presentations is not to say, hey, here are all the answers. It's to facilitate discussion. But can you overcook something? If we're already covering pain and distress, And that's clearly set out in the Animal Welfare Act. What are we adding besides another word, and does that particularly confuse matters? And it was interesting to hear the political views and legal views on the debate yesterday. I thought that was brilliantly organised, because there's some divergent opinions you might have noticed, you know. For the basics of it, sentience occurs in the Animal Welfare Act. So let's move on. In terms of clarity, this same argument regarding nomenclature or reference has been raised by other colleagues from the legal fraternity. In the States, it was made reference yesterday in certain states in the US. It's now the norm to refer to what were once owners as guardians. And I won't name names at this point, but undoubtedly there's a wonderful sentiment to that about responsibility for animals. But law is a house of words. If you change the word, you potentially change the obligations. And if you put one more person into the mix, one more stakeholder, then potentially, instead of, if it was just Bob and I, there's a two-way street. Bob to me to Bob. Now if we add the sneezing Sarah, sorry Sarah, into that issue, we've got now, can you see the direction? There's at least 8, if not 9, potential paths of communication. Add another one. It can potentially add confusion. And Sandy, my legal colleague Sandy, has indicated that, you know, it's caused some confusion. I had the vice president, or one of the vice presidents of the ASPCA, staying at my home just literally last weekend, and we were talking about this, and some of the confusion and challenges that are associated with handling stray animals. There has been confusion in that area as a result of some of these changes. For the lawyers, it does have implication, and from what I can gather, that's a challenge being that's on the table for certain spay programs from people. I'm sorry?
If we've already got person in charge, surely guardian's just as easily defined.
We could unpack that, but certainly the duties associated with a guardian under law are not quite as simple as a person in charge. There are obligations on a guardian. You can remove a guardian. There are accountabilities. The legal definition of a guardian is a little bit different to what you're going to find in an Oxford dictionary. So that's where I go back to the animal as an example. The Oxford Dictionary definition of an animal is going to be substantially different in term and effect than the legal definition, according to the different pieces of legislation. So I heard people saying, well, talking about stewardship as an alternative to guardian. But it still comes down to what's the legal responsibility, and we want clarity on that one. In terms of property, as I said yesterday, the discussion regarding property is likely, it's been going for years, it's likely to keep on going. I'd refer to Mike Radford, who's a barrister in the UK, who, in his opinion, suggests that the focus on the property status, in his opinion, potentially misses the point. And he says, he makes these two, he submits these two alternatives for consideration. One is that in terms of the law, it's not about the species, it's about the purpose, or as we've otherwise heard, use of the animals. That's the focus. i.e. you can have a cat that's in your home and it's completely reliant upon its owner or person in charge, Sarah, as opposed to a wild animal that has never even seen a human being. Same species, but its circumstances are significantly different. And Mike Radford makes the point that our responsibilities, and that's the key word, he says law is about responsibility. It's about an obligation that, as Antoine said, if it's legal, it's binding. It's something you can be held accountable for and potentially penalised for. It's about responsibility. So in terms of the property, in Section 10 of the Animal Welfare Act, it refers to responsibilities, positive duties of care, and it's the last line that's often overlooked. It refers to this dependent upon the species, the environment, and the circumstances. And the circumstances goes to what Mike Radford refers to as the purpose or use of the animal. So in Mike Radford's view, perhaps we're missing the point by focusing on nomenclature or categorisation and losing sight of, potentially, this focus on what's our responsibilities. The appointment of a commissioner, I noticed, was referred to by Antoine and was dealt to by the politicians yesterday, so I've just left that free there. In terms of practices, I think that probably underpins much of what's going on here in terms of our questions. I think it pays to remember that this is about incremental change. Again, look back historically. Sometimes there's an advantage in looking back to see how far we've come and realising that the importance of discussions like this. So we seek to understand, collaborate and work in partnership together to move things forward. But it'll change by a process of incremental change, and it depends on what's acceptable. Some of the comments from the lawyers yesterday about probably what's appropriate, what they'd like to see, what they don't see, but in context of what's practical and realistic in terms of contemporary views. It's about what's, you heard Antoine refer to, what's publicly, politically palatable or acceptable. But practices will change, undoubtedly, because what's the evidence for that? They have. In terms of the link, well, one of the great things, what are we doing well? We actually have 3 district court judgments in New Zealand that haven't, I think in terms of pictures frequently, they haven't thrown open the door, but they've certainly unlocked it. And that'll dovetail into this last point I come through here. In terms of penalties, there's a clear government message about the importance of animal welfare and that animal welfare matters. We talked about, the VADE model is not all about education any more than it's all about prosecuting people. It's about compliance. And that's part and parcel, that's supported by enforcement. And we referenced penalties, recklessness, and working in partnership. And this is about a principled prosecution. But one of the most exciting things is the initiatives that are being implemented with this amendment. I think sometimes we look at these and we get so focused on where we'd like to be, that sometimes we miss out on what we've actually got. And I'd submit that the codes, as a veterinarian background and lawyer, and it's an animal welfare forum, codes with teeth was just begging for me to put in that box. But it's codes with teeth that will address many of those. You heard Antoine refer, I think his figure was something like 80 to 90% of animal welfare offending is at that lower end. We need to be able to do something about it, and that's what the codes potentially do. It will develop, it being, these objectives in terms of animal welfare by a process of incremental change. But I go back to question 1. Does it go far enough? I'd submit that that question might be reframed as, can it go far enough? Ferraris, if you've ever driven a Ferrari, I don't own one, but I've driven one time, and it's almost like you need a operating manual and a trainer to teach you how to run this thing. And in an animal welfare context forum, what do we say? There are no bad dogs, there are just... Sorry? Exactly, okay. Lovely being in a forum like this that we can fill in the gaps. Now, there's probably a few villains. I'll put my veterinary hat on. There are a few dogs and kitty cats that are villains, but for the most part, what we accept is that oftentimes the responsibility for that animal's behaviour falls to the owner. There's a couple of two things there. One is the word responsibility keeps coming up again and again and again. The other thing is that sometimes the outcomes are a reflection more of the driver than the machine. And Richard Posner, who I referred to yesterday, Mike Radford, and others have said, well, here's some other benchmarks of good animal welfare law in terms of breadth of an animal's definition, breadth of liability, the various, the focus on not just anti-cruelty, but positive duties of care, all these bullet points. And they say, with those in place, the machine is there. We're just getting better at driving it. We're getting better at modifying it, implementing bits and pieces that enable us to actually, as I said, I would almost put across that, through that, does, and put can it do enough. New Zealand animal welfare legislation, by global standards, it's a good machine. As the Minister said, it's not broken. But oftentimes I think what we do, those of us with animal interests, through to prosecution, enforcement and so on, we're getting better at implementing things so that the outcomes, I think, provide our own. I liked your slide yesterday, Joyce, where we have this, remember the picture of the calf that Joyce put up, and it was referred to as the eureka moment, I've solved the problem. Sometimes it's not actually reinventing the machine. Sometimes it's learning how to drive the machine well. And perhaps that, in terms of doing things well, can provide an opportunity for our own eureka moment. So, in terms of New Zealand and the central question of connecting legislation, enforcement and sentience, practical protection of animals, things will shift. It's not the end of the story. The next question is where to from here? And that's going to be a multifactorial issue, as David Bavell and David Meller and others have already noticed. But Kevin Stafford, if some of you know him, he's a veterinary scientist out at Massey University. He's very strong on happy animals. As a lawyer, I'm not sure that we're ever going to see the word happy in legislation. Maybe something similar. Antoine talks about the dignity of the animal. We've talked about innate value and so on. Maybe. But what I am very confident of is that in terms of where would you rather be, at least Kiwi animals will be among the most happy. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
I think what we might do is with our forum later on, because I'm sure there are some questions again, we have our forum this afternoon.
Yes, sir.
Questions for anything, I'm just conscious of the time.
Sure.